In this video, I will be showing you how I make bone bodices with invisible boning channels. I have developed these techniques throughout several years of sewing and want to share them with you. I am in no way saying this is the only or the best way to make a bodice like this. I just want to share how I personally make them. So let's start off with all of the fabrics I always use when I make a bodice. I always use 2 strength layers and I use a cotton twill fabric for that. This is a very tightly woven, very thick fabric that is great for using as strength layers for your bodices. For corsets and stuff you could also use coutil, which is used a lot historically and just for corsetry in general, but that's quite pricey and I know there are a lot of places where you can't really get coutil. I only know like 1 or 2 places here in the Netherlands where I can buy it, but yeah, it's quite pricey as well, so that's why I always use cotton twill. This is a very strong fabric and yeah, it worked great for bone bodices. And this cotton twill I buy is like €8 or something per meter, so that's very affordable, for me at least. Then I have my fashion fabric, and my fashion fabric of course depends per project. For this bone bodice I'm going to make, the skirt is made of chiffon and it's going to get chiffon cape sleeves. So the fashion layer of the gown will be made from that same chiffon. So yeah, this is my fashion layer for this project. But you could use anything you want, basically satin or like linen, cotton, chiffon, mesh, tulle, just anything can be a fashion layer really. But yeah, for my project it's this really lovely petrol chiffon. Then I have my lining. I kind of made it my thing for when I do commissions and bodices for myself. This is a commission for someone, by the way. This will not be for my body, for myself. But I always use really cute patterned, like floral linings to line my bodices with. You won't even see it in the end, but I think it's just so cute to use a really cute looking lining. And then when you see the inside of the bodice, sometimes like, oh, that's really cute. So yeah, I always get one that kind of at least matches the fabric. I couldn't find a petrol one, so I got a dark blue one in this case. But yeah, I love using cute linings. And this is just a regular thin cotton. As you can see, just any cotton will do. I wouldn't use something too thin, but I also wouldn't use something too thick. So just a regular cotton like this is perfect. You could even use like a linen or something, but yeah, I prefer using cotton. And then lastly, I have this satin that I'm going to be using to make the piping for the bodice. You can either bind your edges in bias binding or piping. I prefer using piping whenever I can because I think it just looks really cute and pretty. So I'm going to be showing you how I make piping in this video as well. And for this one I'm using satin because it gives a nice glow to the bodice. And I forgot to mention my interfacing. I always put a layer of interfacing somewhere in my bodice. This is the H200 interfacing. I like to use one that has a bit more structure to it. So yeah, I use this, and I will show you later, but I always use this to line my fashion layer with. And I have a whole bolt of interfacing. As you can see, I have this in white as well. I have it because I own a costuming business. I do commissions all the time, so I use a lot of interfacing. But you can also just get these in packages of like 2 or 3 meters, I believe. To explain what I'm going to do in advance, so you know how this video is going to build up, I wrote down how I make my bodices, like how many layers they have. So we start here at the top layer and then we work down to the bottom layer, or the lining of the fabric, the bodice. So we start off with my fashion layer. This is the outermost layer of the bodice, and this is actually made up out of 3 different fabrics. or like layers, however you want to see it together. I have my fashion fabric, and usually when I make costumes or corsets or something, my fashion fabric is quite thin, so I baste that to my strength layer. So I basically flatline one strength layer of cotton twill with my fashion fabric. I will show you how I do that, of course. And then I treat them as one layer. So these two together will make up one layer of the bodice. And then I have my interfacing, and in this case, for this bodice, because my fashion layer or my fashion fabric is chiffon, you will see the interfacing through the fabric. So I'm going to put my interfacing on my cotton twill, my strength layer. But if the fashion fabric is not see-through, so like a satin or something, I always put my interfacing on my fashion fabric, and then I base my fashion fabric to the strength layer. So that's the first layer, these three together. Then we have the strength layer, and this is going to be a bodice with invisible boning channels. So in that case, I add the boning channels, made from twill tape in this case, to the strength layer. I also in the future want to make a video showing how I make my bone bodices when you have visible boning channels, so when they're stitched into the corset or the bodice, because I do that a bit different. But for this one it's going to have invisible boning channels, so the boning channels will be on the strength layer, and then behind that strength layer will be the lining of the bodice. So that's how it's going to be built up, and this is how this video is going to be built up as well. I always draft my own sewing patterns for my bodices, and I'm unfortunately not going to show you how I draft my patterns, because it took me several years of education to learn, and my school has their own pattern drafting methods. But you can still apply these techniques to your own patterns or even commercial sewing patterns. I'll insert some footage of what my pattern for this bodice looked like though. I wanted to show everyone here how I draft my Modesty panel pattern for in the back. So I always draft my patterns with a lacing gap of about 4 centimeters. I don't even know how I got to that, but throughout the years of making bone bodices, this is just what I ended up doing for most patterns. I usually take a lot out at the waist for my pattern so that it fits around the waist, and then I like having a lacing gap. So yeah, I take 4 centimeters off, so in total that will be 8 centimeters. But throughout the years of drafting these patterns, I have found out that that 8 centimeter lacing gap is going to end up being like 6 or something, or maybe 5. So that's why I started doing 4, because previously I did like 2 centimeters or something, but then I ended up not having a lacing gap, or after a mock-up finding out that I needed to take more out here. So yeah, that's how I got to the 4 centimeters. And if you want to have an even bigger lacing gap, then you can take it in even more. But this is what I always do. But for the Modesty panel, I always take a piece of patterning paper. I line it up with my outermost bone right here. I always do 2 bones in the back, flat steel, and then the eyelets will go right here in between. So this is going to be a boning channel, and this is going to be a boning channel, and this will be the eyelets. So yeah, I always line up the piece with my outermost boning channel, because the Modesty panel is going to be stitched on the inside by hand to this boning channel right here. So that's why I line it up there. And then I just trace basically this whole piece. Here you can see the real center back of the panel, this or pattern, this line right here. I always end up adding 2 more centimeters to that, just to be sure that if the lacing gap ends up being bigger, that the Modesty panel really covers the entire back, especially when I'm doing something for a client like this. This is a commission. I can't do a fitting because she lives in a different country. So just to be safe, I end up adding some extra space here. So this is the center back on my pattern, and then this is going to be the center back of my Modesty panel. And then I trace that, mark it, then I fold my paper in half, and then I just cut it out all around and fold it open so you have an even Modesty panel. And then I mark the center back of the Modesty panel because a boning channel is going to come here, and I mark the waistline so that once I stitch the Modesty panel to this bone right here on the inside, I can line up the waistline of the Modesty panel with the waistline on my bodice to make sure that everything lines up perfectly. I wanted to show you all how I'm going to cut my my bodice pieces and how many of each pattern piece you need. So here I kind of drew out what the bodice pattern will look like. So this is the center front, right here's the center back where the lacing will be, and then all of the panels in between. And let's say you cut, because you fold your fabric in half and then you cut 2 of every piece, so everything is doubled, as you always cut things out of fabric. But let's say we start with the fashion layer, which is the outermost layer. We're going to do this like I explained here. It's going to have the fashion fabric, the strength layer, and interfacing. So that's what we're going to do first. The fold of the fabric is right here on this line. This will be cut on the fold. And then we're going to cut all of these twice, so double the fabric. So you cut them out once, but it's 2 pieces. But then for the center back piece, we're going to have one that will be on the outside of the bodice, but then we're also going to have a facing piece, which is folded to the inside, so that it has really nice finish in the back. Later in the video it will make sense if it doesn't right now. But because we also need this 5th piece to fold to the inside of the bodice, you need to cut that 4 times. So that's 2 times on doubled fabric. So once you've cut this piece out once, you're going to trace it and you're going to baste and everything. And then you're going to take that 5th piece again and cut it out once again. And you're going to do that for your strength layer, your fashion layer, and your interfacing. So all of these. Then for the strength layer, the 2nd layer of the bodice that will get the boning channels, you only need all of this once. So on doubled fabric, you're going to have to fold here again. You're going to cut all of these 1 time. And then lastly, for the lining layer, you're going to cut all of these once. So again with the fold, doubled fabric, and then every pattern piece once, which will be 2 pieces for an entire bodice around. And then for the Modesty panel, you're going to cut 2 of the strength layer, so on doubled fabric that's once, and 2 of the fashion layer, so again on doubled fabric 1 time. When you cut out your bodice pattern pieces, make sure they are all straight on grain by measuring if the grain line on your pattern is even with the sides of the fabric both at the top and the bottom of the marked grain line on your pattern piece. I draw my seam allowances around my panels with a regular white pencil. These pencil markings will all be hidden inside the bodice or cut off anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I always add 1 centimeter seam allowance all around my pattern pieces, but you can also do more than that if you want to. The arm side is going to be bound with bias binding, so those don't need any seam allowances. The top and bottom of the bodice will be finished with piping, and you need at least 1 centimeter seam allowance for that as well. This will be cut off once the piping has been stitched to the edge. I mark all of my pattern pieces with a tracing wheel. This works really well in my opinion, and I've been doing it like this for ages. The lines it leaves will all be hidden inside the bodice, so it doesn't really matter if they're visible. Make sure you also mark the waistline and any notches that might be on your pattern. So right now I'm going to be cutting the fashion layer, the very outermost layer of the bodice. And I quickly wanted to explain something about that. So right here I have the strenght layer that the fashion layer will be basted to. I already marked all of my seam allowances here, as you can see. And what I'm going to do now, instead of using my paper pattern that I made to cut the fashion layer, I am going to be using my already cut strenght layer as my pattern for this, because especially when you're using a fabric that moves around as much as the chiffon does, it is very recommended to cut it just as an entire, like, single piece of fabric. So I'm going to be cutting all of the pattern pieces separately. And the reason why you do that is, again, because it moves around a lot and you get a more accurate cut if you cut it as just one single bit of fabric. You can already see as I'm touching it that it's moving around a lot, even though I put a lot of weight stuff at the back. So yeah, I'm going to be pinning these just as single pieces to my fabric like this, making sure that it is straight on grain. And then yeah, just cut them out around this piece. And I can do that because the seam allowance is already on these strenght pieces. So if I cut this out along the edges, then you get an accurate cut. And then after that we're gonna baste the fashion layer to the strenght layer, so it's really one piece. Right now I got the first row of pattern pieces out, and as you could see from me pinning it, I cut all of them separately on one piece of fabric. And yeah, this is what you will have in the end. As you can see, you get a pretty accurate cut, and tiny bits like this don't really matter too much. And sometimes when a lot of it sticks out, I end up, once it's basted to the strenght layer, I end up cutting off some of these edges as well, but it's not a really big problem. And you could see me cutting with my fabric scissors. I wanted to mention that you can also use a rotary cutter for it. Personally, I absolutely hate this thing. I got it because everyone was recommending it to me to cut out thin fabrics. So I bought this and I have my cutting mat. I tried it and I really did not like it. I tried it a couple times to see if it would grow on me. It just did not. So I own this, but I never use it. If you cut with fabric scissors, because with the rotary cutter you actually cut like this, so you don't really lift up the fabric, so it's supposed to give you a very accurate cut, but again, I just don't like it. You could try it for yourself and see if you do, but for me it just didn't work, because when you cut a thin fabric with fabric scissors, of course, to get the scissor under, you need to lift up the fabric a bit, and when it moves around a lot like a thin chiffon like this, there is a chance of you not getting a cut as accurate. But as you can see, like, if you just pin very carefully, it will be fine in the end. I also really quickly wanted to give a little shout out or recommendation for the desk I'm using. I got these a couple months ago. I own 2 of them. These are from IKEA. This is the biggest size. I believe mine is 160 by 80 centimeters. These desks are incredible because there is this little thing right here. I don't know what you call this in English, but you can pull it out and you can higher and lower your desk and adjust them to your size. So whenever I'm cutting fabric like this, I just put up my desk so I can cut my fabric standing without having to bend over awkwardly, because previously I always cut my fabric on the floor, but that gave me a lot of back and knee issues. So I bought these when I started my own business and sewing full time. And it has really been a lifesaver. So when I'm hand sewing or pinning something or just working in general, I level it with my other desk right there. And when I'm cutting fabric like this, I raise it up a lot and I can just cut standing and put it even higher or lower and completely adjust it to my size. So yeah, these are from IKEA and I really recommend them. The lining is cut in the exact same way as the strength layers. Again, make sure your pattern pieces are all straight on grain, and I added 1 centimeter of seam allowance around the pattern pieces, except for the arm side. Okay, I'm going to have to explain something here again, because I am about to cut my interfacing that will be ironed into one of the strength layers of the bodice. I'm going to explain something about the way I cut my interfacing to balance out the stretch of the fabric of the layer that it will be ironed into. So you need to check the stretch, like the grain it stretches on. So if you look at this, if I pull my strength layer like this, so the vertical direction of the fabric, it doesn't stretch. Whereas if I pull it here, of course it doesn't stretch too much, but you can see there is some stretch in there. So we can determine that it stretches horizontally and not vertically, like this. There's no stretch at all in here. And especially when you work with a fashion fabric that is a bit more on the stretchy side, this is really important to do, because this takes away some of the stretch lines, like the pulling lines that might be created in your bodice. And if we then look at the interfacing, because interfacing, at least the one I use, has quite a lot of stretch to it. So this one stretches, I laid it down so it stretches vertically and not horizontally, as you can see. Maybe a little bit of stretch, but not too much. So I'm going to cut my interfacing pieces in such a way that it goes against the stretch of the fabric it will be ironed into, to kind of stabilize that stretch. So my interfacing will stretch vertically, whereas my bodice will stretch horizontally. It doesn't take away all of the pulling lines. It also has to do with the way you cut your panels and the way your pattern pieces are shaped. But this, I have discovered, helps as well. As with the other pattern pieces, make sure your pattern is yet again straight on grain. The interfacing doesn't need any seam allowance around it, so you can just line up the pattern pieces right next to each other. I didn't film it because it doesn't really look interesting to show, but I just ironed all of my interfacing pieces into the first strength layer, and now I'm going to be basting the fashion layer to these first strength layers. So the interfacing is going to the inside, So I'm going to go like this. Then it's going to have one of the fashion fabric layers pasted right on top of it like this. So that's what you're going to be seeing right now. And then the interfacing will be in the back. Right here you can see me baste the fashion layer of the bodice to the strength layer with the interfacing. I baste these together with sewing machine thread rather than basting thread. This slides to the fabric a bit easier in my opinion. You can do quite large basting stitches, but don't make them too long or your layers will still move around and that kind of defeats the purpose of the basting. Besides basting the pattern pieces together, I also run some basting thread along the waistline of every single pattern piece of all of the layers. For the Modesty panel, I also mark the center back. This line will be needed when we sew the boning channels into the Modesty panel later on. Okay, right now I have all of my bodice pieces prepared. This will be the outer fashion layer, so that's the first strength layer with the interfacing, as you can see, with the fashion fabric pasted on top of it. So this will be the outermost layer of the bodice. Then we have the strength layer that will go in between. This is the layer the boning channels and the waist tape will be stitched to. And then here we have the lining. Where I just marked my waist seam, and this will go, well, yeah, the lining of the bodice. And here's the Modesty panel, but I always leave that for one of the last things to do. So what we can do right now is either stitch all of these together as separate bodices, but that takes a couple hours to like do the same thing over and over and over again. Basically you're making 3 of the exact same bodices, which can be quite tedious to do. So I won't make you watch that anyway, because that will be really boring, but I'm gonna have to sew all of that together by myself. And I don't really feel like doing that right now. So I'm going to work on the strength layer. I'm going to sew all of these together, which you will see in a second. And then we're going to add the waist tape, and we're going to add the boning channels, and then we can already add the boning to this. And then after that I'm probably going to sew the other bodices together. But yeah, I think that's how I'm going to do it. So when you make your own bone bodice yourself, you that gets invisible boning at least, because when you do visible boning channels, it's different. But this video focuses on invisible boning channels. So then you can decide for yourself if you really want to sew all of these 3 bodices after each other, which takes quite a long time and you're doing the same thing over and over and over again. Or you can work on your strength layer first and kind of change things up. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm pinning my bodice pieces together, making sure I'm pinning perfectly on the seam allowance line I traced earlier, and also making sure the waistline matches up with the previous piece. After that I sew it all together by machine. You can either pin your whole bodice together first and then sew it, or pin and then sew and pin and sew like I'm doing right here. Once everything is stitched down, I press the seam allowances open really well. I just pressed open all of the seams on the strenght layer of the bodice, as you can see, and I quickly wanted to say something. I added 1 centimeter seam allowance to the center back of the strenght layer, but just like on the lining of the bodice, you don't actually need that 1 centimeter seam allowance. So I'm going to go ahead and cut this off because this will be hidden inside of the bodice, and the facing flap from the outer layer will cover this, so this will just sit nicely against the center back, so that's why you don't need the seam allowance. So yeah, if you added that here, you can just cut it off. In this video, I also quickly wanted to give a shout out to this book. It's called Making Corsets. This is the author. I got this a year ago, and it's literally the most helpful corset making book that I own, and I own quite a lot of them. This book goes, I'm not going to show everything because you need to buy it for yourself, but it goes into 3 different corset making techniques, which is really helpful. This helped me with my bone bodices as well. How to do the boning channels, insert a waist tape, how to do the binding, just everything. And it also in the front goes into making mock-ups and how to adjust the mock-ups. It goes right here at the start into how to make the corset pattern. And yeah, this book is literally like, it has become my corset Bible. So if you want to learn more about corset making, I believe this is like 30 euros or something. And it's quite, like, there's a lot of information in this. So it's definitely worth buying. I really recommend it. I will put a link or something, or the name of the book, in the description of this video so that you can go and purchase it for yourself. Because again, I highly recommend it. I'm pinning my waist tape to my strenght layer, which is the layer that will be in the middle of the bodice. For waist tape, I used 3 cm wide twill tape. Make sure that the center of the twill tape lines up with the waistline on the bodice. Once everything is pinned down, I base it in place with some sewing machine thread. I sew the waist tape down by flipping the bodice to the right side and stitching down into the seam, right where the waist tape is. After my waist tape is stitched down, I add my boning channels. I use 1.5 cm wide twill tape for this. I let my boning channels end about 1.5 cm away from the top and bottom edge of the bodice. Then I sew the boning channels in place. I make sure they are about 1 cm in width. I also close up the bottom of the channel. We only need the top to be open to insert the boning. Or you can do it the other way around and sew the top shut and then insert the boning from the bottom, whatever you prefer. I spared you all from having to look at this, but I just stitched together the fashion layer of the bodice. The reason why I didn't film this is because it's literally the exact same as you just saw me do for the strength layer earlier in this video. So yeah, I just matched up the waist seam. This is exactly why I mark my waist, so you can really line it up neatly. And when you fit it on your dress form, or maybe on your client if they come over for a fitting, or when you fit it on yourself, you can see if the waistline sits in the right place. And I just find it really handy to have my waist basted onto it. So yeah, I just stitched all of this together. And I also added the facing flaps. So this is actually the center back panel. And as you can see, the same one is mirrored onto it, because this fabric piece right here, this pattern piece, is going to go and fold to the back. So then this is where the eyelets are going to go. And then when you look at the inside, obviously it doesn't look good now, but once the lining and everything is in, this will very neatly cover the back and you have this really nice facing piece. I might cut off a little bit of this in the end. I always make sure it's like straight. But yeah, that gets folded under, stitched down by hand, which we're going to do later in this video, or maybe in part 2, I don't know. I might cut this into 2 parts because I feel like this is going to be a very long video. But yeah, we're going to stitch this down, so that is why you need to cut extra pieces for the center back, because those are going to be stitched on, and that gives a really nice finish here at the center back. So yeah, that's what I did right now. And I'm probably not going to show you, but I'm going to be removing all of this vertical basting right here, because these panels are stitched together, so we don't need all of this basting anymore. I'm just going to leave the basting here at the center back, at the top, the arm's eye, and the bottom here. So all of these I'm going to take out. I almost forgot to add a very important boning channel to my strength layer, and that is the center front boning channel. Now, I put my boning on all of the seams for this. That is what I usually do. You can put boning in other places as well if you want to, but I usually just follow the seams. But there is no seam on the center front of the bodice, as you can see. But I in the past have made the mistake to have a bodice or corset that doesn't have a seam or a busk in the front. And I didn't end up adding a bone to this center front right here. And if you then like tighten it and wear it, the front doesn't hold shape too well because there's no boning in it, but it's quite a large pattern piece, so you get this kind of like wrinkling like this, and it just really doesn't look good. So I started stitching a boning channel onto the center front as well, and this is going to get an extra bone even though there's no seam, just to keep the front nice and tight, which looks way better in the end. So yeah, I just stitched this down, and all of the other boning channels just follow the seams. And then at the center back, it's going to get 2 more boning channels around the eyelets, but those are going to be stitched into the bodice rather than have like loose boning channels like this. But we'll get back to that later in the video. So yeah, this boning channel right here, the center front boning, is really important if you don't have a seam or a busk closure right here. So yeah, don't forget to add that one. I went ahead and stitched the lining of the bodice together as well, and that leaves us with 3 of the same, or more or less the same at least, bodices. We have the outermost fashion layer that has the fashion fabric, the strength layer with the interfacing ironed into it. Then we have the middle layer, which is the strength layer with the boning channels in this case, and the waist tape. And then we have the lining layer that goes on the inside. So yeah, this is what we have right now, and now I'm going to add the boning to the strength layer. That was it for the first part of my bodice video. I had to cut these into 2 videos because of the length of them. So go over to part 2 for more information on how to sew a bone bodice.